Hello and welcome, Jane. Lovely to see you, and welcome everybody watching. My name's Mike Jenkins, and I'm joined today by writer Jane Metcalfe. Now, Jane, we're here to talk about your book, Things in Heaven and Earth, which has a subtitle of A True Story of Love, Mystery, and Transformation.
Yes.
Now, I've read the book, and it's a fascinating story, but Jane's going to tell us a little bit about it. So I wonder, Jane, uh, if you would tell us, well, first of all, for somebody who's not read the book, for somebody who's new to it, what might you say to them that it's about? How would you sort of perhaps summarize? And it's a really tough question to ask about your own work, but how might you sort of summarize it?
Well, it is tough because, in a way, when I was writing it, it was very hard to find the pitch, if you want. I mean, if you're looking at how you want to market a book, which is a terrible word, but in a way, you want to reach an audience, let's put it that way, you look for the angle. In my mind, it's a very human story, but about a very paranormal or even spiritual experience that happened between two people. So it has two elements, and well, more than two, but it has, in a way, what the title is taken from, which is a quote from Hamlet, which I think, if I get this correct, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than your philosophy has dreamt of. So that's me. I often muddle up the Horatio, but I don't think it matters. It's a very well known quote. And I think the whole of Hamlet, I was thinking on my walk this morning, actually brings a lot of things to the surface, that things are never exactly what they seem. And in
Mm,
fact, if you want to watch any Shakespeare play, that's obvious. Um, but I think that we have an assumption about life, and we think it's either a this or a that, depending on what your education or where you've come from.
mm,
But sometimes something enters into your life that is way outside of the accepted norm, if
mm,
that exists.
mm,
And so I would tell people that this is about an experience that came completely unbidden to two strangers when they were introduced. And it catapulted them into, I can only say, use their words, a parallel life, or as though they were suddenly, their old life fell away and this parallel life started to happen. So when I say fell away, of course, they continued in the people they were in their lives, but internally, everything changed dramatically.
mm,
And out of this came an extremely clear awareness of what reality is, and I mean with a big R. So the overall reality. It's a bit like us perhaps being catapulted into space and seeing Earth from above, somehow. So the tenor of it is it's a very human story and an intriguing story because it's about a playwright, an unknown playwright who goes to Hollywood to work on a project and is introduced to a very famous film actress.
mm,
And that when they were introduced, this experience happened. Um, it's also a mystery, looking at the subtitle, because I haven't, and well, only a very close few, none of us know who this actress was because she was very famous.
right.
Um, but the playwright happened to be my first husband from a very early, young marriage.
Yeah.
Too far back for me to want to admit, but it was, I had re-met him, but I just had it got into my head I'd quite like to find out, as we do as we get a bit older, what had happened to him.
Mm,
And I discovered that he was a well-established BBC Radio 4 drama playwright.
mm,
Um, and I visited him, and through my visit to him and some of the writing I was starting to explore at that time, moving away from my background as a singer and singing teacher, um, he felt that I might be the right person to, to present this story to whoever. He wasn't very specific, but so I came to be in charge of a lot of material, of interviews that happened about this experience, and it took me a long time to find a way to presented in a book. And
Yeah.
so my way was to present the very human mystery and story that built up to the meeting and followed on, as well as obviously the very strange material about these two people's experience. So it's a very long-winded answer, Mike, but I don't
But
know
no, but
whether
it's very helpful, and you know, having read the book, I think that's a very accurate summary. And as you say, there was all this material that you were entrusted with, and that included letters between the two people, didn't it? And diary entries,
yes,
and correspondence between some of the people who witnessed the event.
yes,
As you say, it was obviously a for those who witnessed it, it was quite dramatic, and they all felt something very profound had happened. And they, from what I remember in the book, they sort of seek to sort of investigate it and find out, and they have
yes,
meetings about it. So it was quite a big thing for that group of people.
yes, yes. And I think the thing is, the difficulty is that it is nothing that you can put your finger on. It's a bit like anyone, if they have, well, in our own heads, whether you're daydreaming or whether you have, in terms of spirituality, a really full-on mystical spiritual experience. You know, if you try and reduce that down into words, I mean, words, as is often stated in the book, and indeed by the great spiritual teacher Krishnamurti, that the word is not the thing; it's just a description. So a book looks like a book because we agree it's a book, but you know, it's so much more than that. And when you start to sort of see in the spaces in between, in the gaps, you begin to see other things going on, but you can't bring them to mean a lot to people, but you can point the way, you can
Yes.
point them to it. And so what happened to them, to some people who've read the book, they've just said, well, did they make it up, or you know,
Mhm.
surely that couldn't have happened. And I'm saying, well, no, there's no surely about it. You know, I myself have had experiences that I don't share with the whole world because, you know, they're very private to me and they're very pertinent to me. But I think most people do. Personally, I think we have all sorts of experiences that we sometimes, depending who we are, brush aside or enter into that help transform our lives.
No,
So,
I completely agree. And what strikes me as well unique about the book, and about the, you know, what happened to these two people, is that, you know, often, and you know, I've read a lot of spiritual books and spiritual teachings, and actually stories of personal stories of awakenings. So, you
mm,
know, perhaps people who've suffered for many years with addictions or illness, or, you know, deep depression, and then suddenly there's been an event and they've woken up, or and then they're transformed, you know, that actually
mm,
their lives are very visibly different, you know, to the people around them and for them themselves. And what seems very unique about this account, is that it appears that it was the meeting of the two people together, that it was the very fact that they met and joined, so they met together, that was the catalyst
yes.
for this falling away of self, but some people might see it as, or, you know, this waking up into a greater, sort of more mysterious reality.
Yes, I think that's a very fair point, Mike, because it is a fairly unique thing. A lot of people actually, they may, well, let's say if you were taking someone who goes on a spiritual journey and they encounter a spiritual teacher, and there's often a talk of a transmission that happens between the two, and therefore there may be an experience or there may not. But when you're talking of two strangers who meet with no expectations whatsoever,
Mm.
no anticipation,
Mm.
and no name to bring to what happened.
Yes.
I mean, both of them had been in a way on their own journeys and paths as we all are. It was, I think, I'm sure it's not unique. I'm sure there are other people who've had this happen, but one of the stranger things that I think is often missed, and it is in the diaries, it's described in the diaries,
Mm.
is that Colin, who was my first husband and the main character, he went to the cinema as a boy of about 13 and saw a film with this actress in because she was older than him, and he knew he would meet her one day when he was young, and he began to have stories of her life in his head.
Right.
And describes it as he couldn't understand them. And when he talked to his school friends about it, they said, "Oh, it's just a crush. You know, you've got a
Yes.
crush on her," which they would. And so by the time he left school, he left very early. I think maybe even 15 in those days we could leave. So, he left, and he then forgot about it. He pushed it to the back of his mind.
Mm,
And when he met her, of course, it all resurfaced.
right.
And when he actually told her some of the things that he'd seen, she confirmed that every single thing he'd seen had happened.
Right.
And
Right.
and you see, that's why I think that, if people are interested in the paranormal or psychic events, it falls into that category. Um,
Definitely.
and but what came out of it is that both of them did, as you alluded to, Mike. They both had their own awakenings to uh, never again be. And I really know this, having known Colin. He's no longer alive now, but just not bothered by the world, not caught up into the dramas of,
Mm,
oh, poor
mm,
me, and how am I going to cope in the world, and what's
mm.
going to happen. He just got on with his life. I don't know her. I think I know. I'd be a 98% sure I have guessed who she is, and if it is who I think it is, there was always, certainly in later interviews, a poise about her that I found was, and a light in her eyes. I may be dreaming that, but
Mm.
so they didn't stay together. It wasn't something that was romantic in one sense. There was a very huge attraction, but they never lost touch for the whole of the rest of their lives.
Right. Right.
So,
Fascinating. Really
mm,
fascinating. And for anyone who perhaps is perhaps on a spiritual path and consciously looking for new books to read on the matter. I think the fascinating thing about this book is that, well, one, it's a true account of, with all the letters and the diary entries we've got, is a kind of um, it's almost like there is this mystery, like you're piecing it
yes,
together because you're looking, oh, that was this date and in this location, and
yes,
so that side of it I think is really fascinating. But then in the second half, Colin talks about what happened, and he talks about that kind of what some people might call ultimate reality, or
yes,
awakeness. And he talks through an interview with is it the guy called Steve, and is that the actress's son?
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
So he interviews Colin, and I think that for anyone who perhaps has listened to some of these types of spiritual talks from living teachers now, perhaps they've been on a retreat and they've heard someone talk about this, I think they'd find that really illuminating,
mm,
because Colin speaks in a way that's very unique to him, but it's universal. I remember when I read it, I felt the power of those words. They have the power to transform in a way. That section of the book is its own spiritual talk, its own spiritual teaching.
yes. And actually, I must also go on to say that also Dee. I mean, the names, apart from Colin and a couple of others I knew, are made up in a sense, because they all had initials. So D was initial D, so I called her D as in DEE. So it gave her a name. But she also is interviewed by her son, and has an equal kind of naive wisdom, I want to say. When I say primitive, I mean in the sense of the primitive painters, in that sense. She has got the same thing in her own words, she expresses it. But Colin, um, I think, was incredibly, I don't know, had a brilliant mind, that's all I can say. And
Yeah.
so the way he writes, some people have found that very difficult to read. But
Yes, I'm sure.
as much as you might try and read the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita, all of
well,
these things,
well,
they're difficult.
yeah, and funnily enough, it reminded me. So years and years ago, a friend came to stay with me, and she left behind a copy of The Power of Now by
Oh
Eckhart
yes,
Tolle, and
yes,
she couldn't get on with it, so
yeah.
she left it at mine and said, "Oh, see what you think of it." Now I picked it up, and I couldn't get on with it. I thought it sort of doesn't really make any sense. The way the language was used, I couldn't make sense of it. And then about a year later, 2 years later, maybe even, I had an illness, and that precipitated a kind of spiritual search. And suddenly I picked up the book and it made complete sense.
Absolutely. And that's how it often happens. I mean, the same happened for me. I actually, there's a book that sort of is not that well known in a way, but in certain communities, called A Course in Miracles.
Mm.
And it was a channeled work, and it came out in England somewhere in the 80s, I think, the mid 80s. And someone gave me a copy of it, and I hitherto had done, I mean, I'd always been aware, I had my own experience when I was younger. I read the book as though it was a blockbuster, and I understood every word. And then I went back to it about a year later, and it was gobbledygook. And
Yeah.
it's very interesting that way round, because I know it was given to me. It's like I knew internally what the message was. It's only a way it sounds a very weak way of putting it, but I think I must have known. I was just awake to it. And then gradually I did work with that book for a long time, and
Mm.
it presented ideas to me that, in a way, my Jane Metcalfe egoic state, if you want, the character I am, really fought against them. We always
Yes.
do. But
Yeah.
when you actually really, it's like put your head above the water and you actually breathe the air, or above the parapet, then, there's so much more to life that isn't just the physical. I mean, in a sense, as we're being shown or being forced to look at now in this current situation that's been going on for so many, a year and a half nearly now, it's certainly thrown up for me and for many others. What is the nature of reality? Who are we? I
Mm.
mean, how do I find a place in this world? There's no givens. So I think this book, um, I know some of the people who've read that part, they just can't read it. Just as Mike said, like The Power of Now. And I just think it's the way it is. I would like it to reach a more, I want to, an audience who's ready to read that kind of thing. I have to be careful, because it's like we're all at different stages.
Yeah.
But it is difficult, because the book has an appeal, it on both sides. Personally, if it was me, I like to hear both of them. I like the story and and Colin's experience.
Mm.
But it is what it is, and I did want to mention that the way I actually came to come by this material is that the woman who documented most of what happened
Mm.
was the actress's clairvoyant, so it makes it even more bizarre. And she had felt that what happened had the power to transform other people, and she wanted it to be shared with as many people as possible.
Mm.
And she was waiting for the right person to do that. And I had gone quite innocently to visit my Colin and his wife then. They're both no longer with us. And he said, "Oh, I wonder if you might be the right person for it." And it turned out I was. So, I mean, that is bizarre.
Well, that in itself, exactly. So that's what's so intriguing, I think, about this story in the book is that even the way it came about is
Mm,
quite unusual, you know.
mm,
So and I think that clairvoyant was right. I think the book does have the power to transform, and because in a way, I think what happened to them was if you like, pure spirit, or kind of pure life energy
yes,
transforming them,
absolutely.
and so therefore in the retelling of it, it has that that power.
Mm,
But I think it's interesting. You mentioned the Course in Miracles, and a lot of people have had that experience, and I did as well. When I first picked it up, I thought, oh, it doesn't really make grammatical sense to me. But then I think the reason for that is that, and I think perhaps the reason people may struggle with Colin's section in the book is because so much of an expression of that kind of awakened state, if you like, is paradoxical. So
mm,
language almost is not quite suited. You said the word's not the thing, and it has this limitation, doesn't it, where language mostly exists in duality,
mm,
where what we're expressing is beyond and before,
mm.
and so it's I
It's
think
kind. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I think that for me, I mean, I love the beginning of the story as well, because it has this narrative, and it's really intriguing. But for me, the really satisfying part of the book is that second half, with more of that expression, if you like, of that reality.
Yeah, and I think as you were talking, I was thinking it becomes for some people a springboard.
Mm.
It can springboard you into another way of seeing things. And it's such a shame to feel that. I always feel that life is lived with blinkers on. That you know there is so much more. We are always bombarded by the physicality of life, and there's obviously it is here, but there is so much more, which is equally as valid. Without which we'd just be zombies walking around. So
Yes.
you know there is so much more to our existence and experience. And I'm really quite, interestingly, by nature, I'm a Taurian, if that means anything, but I'm quite pragmatic in many respects
Mm.
and down to earth. But I do have this life that it's no longer, I no longer want it to be a secret. I mean, it's to those that didn't understand it, you know, it's a rich blend of this whole experience. You know, it's not just one thing.
Yes, exactly. And I think what you said about how that affected them, afterwards, that so they had their ordinary lives, and there were,
Mm.
trials and tribulations and challenges that come along. But I think this, result of that experience, that actually you kind of ride the wave a bit more. That stuff happens, but you're no longer so invested in the drama of the story. You're
Mm.
not kind of. I always think of it as like, the story of myself doesn't sell so many tickets anymore. It's not such a big draw. Our own sort of dramas and our own
Yeah,
sort of,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and it seems that that was very much what, Colin experienced, and Dee as well.
Well, Colin went on from that meeting, which was actually in 1979, so it's
Mm,
a long time ago now.
mm,
He went on to write prolifically for radio drama for about 23, 25 years.
mm,
And I've listened to some of his dramas, which is still sometimes pop up on
mm.
whatever, More For, or one, no, some radio extra, 4 extra,
For Radio 4
and
Extra.
on YouTube. And you know, he was an exceptional writer, but very no desire to be famous, no desire to push his work. So he chose radio because he didn't have to go and mingle with the thing. It wasn't his thing.
Yeah.
And as for her, one can only imagine what a life like hers would be, because she was, and through elimination, I'm so certain it is who I believe it to be. You know, she was in the limelight the whole time. And
Mm,
it's one of the reasons, really, why it was kept secret, because
mm.
she felt, she says in one point in the diaries, that they would have made a mincemeat of her in the press. You know,
And
she
did
didn't want what had happened, and everybody, all the people who were the dinner guests at that party, were all sworn to secrecy. So you know, there's, I mean, maybe one of these days it will come out, but it's not
Yeah.
really relevant. I mean, it's
Yeah.
what happened, and it does beg a belief, but it is actually, I mean, I have documentation to prove it. It's really really happened. So
Yeah. It's
um,
excellent. Well, thank you
I
so.
thank you.
Sorry, is there anything else you wanted to
Well,
say?
no, I just hope it finds its way into a few more readers. You know, people are intrigued by this or interested enough to buy a copy. Which you know, I'm not trying to do a salesperson act, but I really think it has a lot to offer. Um,
It does. It really does. And for anyone watching, Jane herself is a fine writer. And the sections that, that link the whole thing together are really seamless, and very easy and enjoyable to read. So I highly recommend that. And also for anybody who's interested to learn more about Jane and her other work, you can find more about that at, her website, which is www.janemetcalfe.co.uk. Um, Jane's written some wonderful poems that you can read on her website. There's also a short story, and other,
and a blog.
excerpts. A blog, and the blog is great. Absolutely, yeah. The blog, Jane writes regularly on the blog, and there's some fantastic articles, and really interesting perspectives on lots of different things. So I'd encourage you all to have a look at that. And the book you can buy at Amazon. So it's. Do you want to hold it up, Jane? It's. Have you got it there? It's. There we are. Lovely cover. It's Things in Heaven and Earth by Jane Metcalfe,
Yes.
and you can get a copy of that. It's for sale at Amazon. And yeah, I hope that some of you feel called to get a copy and to read it. So thank you, Jane, so much
Thanks, Mike.
for
Thanks.
joining me and talking about the book. I've really enjoyed reading it, and I love talking about the topic in general. Anyway, it's a really great thing that you're doing.
Mm.
So thank you very much, and
Thank you.
see you
I've
soon.
enjoyed the chat. Okay,
Thank you.
bye.
Bye bye.